They marched with artillery. They marched with European officers. They marched believing Ethiopia would fold. In 1876, one of the most modern armies in Africa advanced into the Ethiopian highlands under the command of the Egyptian Khedive, Ismail Pasha, trained by Europeans, supplied with modern rifles, supported by imperial ambition. What happened next should have rewritten how the world understood Africa. Instead, it was buried. At a place called Gura, Ethiopian forces did something history books rarely admit. They annihilated a modern imperial army, not with miracles, not with luck, but with preparation, terrain, and command. European observers recorded it quietly. Egyptian archives minimized it. Colonial histories moved past it. But Ethiopian chronicles never forgot. This is the story of Gura, 1876, an African victory so decisive it had to be erased. By the mid-19th century, Egypt was no longer acting like a province of the Ottoman world. Under Khedive Ismail Pasha, Egypt pursued imperial expansion, aggressively believing it could carve out an African empire stretching deep into the Horn. European advisors encouraged this ambition. French and British officers trained Egyptian troops. Modern rifles replaced older muskets. Artillery units were reorganized along European lines. According to Egyptian military records, later examined by historians like Harold Marcus and Baru Zauda, Egypt believed Ethiopia was fragmented, divided by regional rulers, and technologically inferior. The plan was simple: secure Massawa, move inland, force submission. Egyptian commanders did not expect a war. They expected compliance. This was not a tribal skirmish. This was an African army defeating a modern imperial force trained by Europe, and history immediately tried to look away. What Egypt misunderstood was Ethiopia itself. By 1876, Ethiopia was not a loose collection of tribes. It was a battle-hardened highland civilization with centuries of military experience. Ethiopian royal chronicles, including those preserved in Gondar and Tigray, describe a state accustomed to mobilization, logistics, and regional coordination. At the center of this resistance stood Emperor Johannes IV, and beneath him, one of the most capable commanders in Ethiopian history, Ras Alula Engida. Ethiopian sources consistently emphasize that Ras Alula studied Egyptian movements carefully. He did not rush. He waited. Gura, a fortified position in present-day Eritrea, was selected deliberately. It controlled movement. It favored defenders. It neutralized artillery. This was not improvisation. This was strategy. And here's what history rarely says out loud. Europe was watching, and what they saw at Gura made them nervous. When Egyptian forces reached Gura, they believed the fortress would fall quickly. They were wrong. By every military standard of the time, this should have ended the war in Egypt's favor. But instead, it ended Egypt's ambition entirely. On March 7, 1876, Ethiopian forces launched coordinated assaults that Egyptian officers did not expect. European-trained formations struggled in the terrain. Artillery could not be positioned effectively. Communication lines fractured. According to Ethiopian chronicles, later corroborated by European observers, Ras Alula's forces exploited elevation, timing, and relentless pressure. Egyptian units advanced and were cut down. They regrouped and were surrounded. By March 9th, the Egyptian army had suffered catastrophic losses. Thousands were killed or wounded. Weapons were abandoned. command structures collapsed. This right here is where empires break. Not in speeches, not in treaties, but when reality refuses to obey assumptions. Egyptian sources later admitted defeat, but avoided detail. European historians like Raymond Jonas and Richard Kalk later confirmed what Ethiopian sources had always said. This was not a narrow escape. This was a rout. The consequences of Gura were immediate. Egypt's expansion into Ethiopia ended. Military credibility shattered. Imperial ambitions stalled. Diplomatic correspondence from European powers preserved in British and French archives shows a sudden shift in tone. Ethiopia was no longer described as vulnerable. It was described as dangerous. Egypt never recovered its momentum in the region. Gura became a silent warning, unspoken, but understood. So why isn't Gura widely taught? Because Gura did not fit imperial narratives. Colonial history depended on the assumption that Africa fell easily to modern armies. Gura shattered that illusion. And this is the part that disappears from textbooks. Not the defeat, but who delivered it. European historians acknowledged it quietly. Egyptian records minimized it. Global textbooks moved on. But Ethiopian memory did not. Oral histories, royal chronicles, and later Ethiopian historians, including Tekeste Nagash and Baru Zude, preserved the truth. When Africa won, history whispered. Before Adwa shocked the world, Gura had already warned it. 2 decades later, the world would be forced to acknowledge another Ethiopian victory, Adwa. But Adwa was not a miracle. It was a continuation. Gura proved Ethiopia could defeat modern armies. Adwa confirmed it. Sambi would echo it decades later. Ethiopia was not lucky. It was strategic. Gura was not missing from history. It was filtered out. And now it returns where it always belonged. If this story was never taught to you, ask why. If it was minimized, ask who benefited. Because history is not just what happened. It is what power allowed to be remembered.